Hi. Let me just start by saying that it's such a joy to be here, to be able to talk to you, take part in this conference, look at all your presentations, and just hear about all the great things that you're doing. Before I jump straight into my presentation, let me just give you also a bit of background about myself. As you heard, I'm an English qualified solicitor, and primarily I advise my clients on data protection issues. But then, in my free time and as part of my academic work, I actually look at IP. And looking at data and IP has brought me to realize that the current ISP liability regime in the EU is very complex, very uncertain, and very fragmented. And as part of that realization, I started a research project, and I want to kind of try to untangle this complex web of intermediate liability laws. So what is the problem? Well, as Eleonora has mentioned, ISPs are often best placed to bring the user's infringements to an end. It's kind of the idea that they are like bouncers standing at the door, looking at what's coming at the platform, and they look at and say, well, you're fine, no infringement, you got in. Whoa, whoa, you infringe copyright, you're out. So that sounds great, but the problem is the determination of the duties and responsibilities in this area is very challenging. And there's many reasons for that. A, the obligations are often conflicting. B, there's huge differences between the content removal requirements in the different EU laws. And C, there's an unclear territorial scope of all the obligations. Let's look at the different laws that apply. There are loads of them. But the kind of top 5 ones, the most important ones, are the Information Society Directive, the E-Commerce Directive, the Enforcement Directive, the GDPR, and once passed, the Digital Single Market Directive. They all cover ISP liability, but they differ significantly when it comes to kind of forgiving ISPs for breaches, but also imposing different obligations on them to actually help right holders protect their rights or even prevent infringements from happening. So on one side of the kind of spectrum of the different laws, there's the E-Commerce Directive. The E-Commerce Directive introduces safe harbors because obviously it's quite easy to say, well, let's have the ISPs actually be the bouncers. That's easy if you have 1, 2, 3, 4 works coming onto the platform. If you have thousands and thousands per minute, that is really hard. And obviously, to try to kind of encourage platforms to develop, the European Commission said, well, let's introduce some safe harbors. And these safe harbors basically say, as long as you're an ISP and you had no actual or constructive knowledge of an infringing content to actually entering your platform, you're fine. You can escape liability. But once you actually know, or you should have known, that there's something infringing and you have not expeditiously kind of acted to remove it, you're on the hook. So that sounds pretty great. But then, on the other hand, we have this other side of the spectrum with the Enforcement Directive, the Information Society Directive, the GDPR, and the new proposed directive, which actually limits the extent to which safe harbors are available to ISPs and actually imposes a lot of requirements on ISPs and certain obligations. And as Ilona also mentioned, it kind of even touches on filtering, especially with the new directive. Actually, one of the drafts expressly referring to a filtering mechanism. So a good example of this is the data protection, everyone's favorite GDPR. What it does is arguably it can make ISPs liable the second infringing content enters their platform. Once you process data, you're there. You're potentially liable. The second thing, there's a really broad basis for content removal under Article 17, right of erasure. And thirdly, the process actually for removing of content is much different. So, for example, under Safe Harbor, there's the amount of data you need to provide, the amount of information you need to give to the ISP before you can ask for removal is specified. Under GDPR, it's much more lax, and actually ISPs have to really quickly act on any kind of request from data subjects. And as we'll see in the next slide, actually, there's another problem which is potentially under GDPR, there's no safe harbor whatsoever. So does that sound complicating? Well, that is already pretty harsh on ISPs, but that's not where the problems end. If, for example, all the laws kind of, a bit of scattered, but actually together worked with each other, that would be great. but they don't. So they often cross-refer to each other, but actually do it in a kind of, well, not very consistent or clear manner. So, for example, the e-commerce directive states that it regulates all matters of ISP liability except for data protection laws. So, no safe harbors under GDPR. But then, you look at the GDPR, and that says it shall apply without prejudice to the e-commerce directive, in particular of the liability rules of intermediary service providers in Articles 12 to 15. So, there are safe harbors. So what is the end result? Do we have them? Don't we have them? No clarity. Complex? Well, there's another step. Geographical scope. So as we all know, it's kind of like the phrase that's been repeated over and over again, the internet is borderless. That complicates matters a lot. So the EU is not the only jurisdiction that actually wants to regulate the online content. So ISPs potentially would need to comply with all the laws across the globe. And that's most notably EU and America, which have often two very different approaches to ISP liability, different rules, different laws, different standards. And as we have seen, especially in cases such as Yahoo and Lycra or the Google Costea case, these laws often clash, they don't work together. So for example, if an ISP was subject to an erasure obligation under Article 17 of the GDPR, doesn't mean that it has to delete all the content globally, or just in the EU. How should it act? Again, no clarity. So looking at all the kind of problems with ISP liability, I came up with a couple of questions, which I'm not going to answer now, obviously, but I want to kind of bring them to you, start some brainstorming, and hopefully as part of my research, I'll be able to, well, maybe answer them or just try answering them. So first, which laws would apply if a video uploaded by a user would breach both copyright and data protection laws? When will the ISP be liable? What should they do? Well, would the ISP whose services were used in this way be able to rely on safe harbors? As we've seen, the e-commerce directive says one thing, the GDPR says another. At what point of time would the ISP be liable? Once it acquires knowledge, or as under GDPR, the second the content hits the platform? Could the intermediary be required to monitor the content? On one hand, e-commerce directive says, no, nothing kind of as far as filtering is required. But then GDPR and potentially the new directive says, oh yeah, you have to filter, you have to actively monitor what is happening. Then next, what steps should actually the ISP do once it actually has a request to kind of delete certain content? Should it follow the e-commerce directive requirements or the GDPR requirements? What's happening? And again, can the existing provisions be actually reconciled by skillful interpretation by the courts? Or do we actually need a massive reform of copyright? Is what the European Union is just doing, kind of just patching some of the problems, is that enough? Do we need a bit more? So clearly, as what I think is that we need to harmonize the laws. We need to do this to achieve some clarity and certainty, to find a fair balance between the rights and interests of the different stakeholders, most notably ISPs, right holders, but also users. We need some consistency, and we need to make sure that the legal framework doesn't actually hamper the development of information society, because the European Union would lose massively on that. How should we do it? Sadly, I have no answers yet. I just started my research, and I'll be very excited to also be able to talk to you about all of this after my presentation and maybe hear your thoughts. If you have any great questions, comments, or ideas, I can see I misspelled comments. I'd love to hear from you, and this is my email. And yeah, please contact me, talk to me, and I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.